Okay, welcome back to Religion and Pop Culture here at Web Yeshiva. This topic is a very large one. I have 3 or 4 subtopics within this. Unlike last week, where we talked about a few examples of God and popular culture, and we also looked at the Wikipedia article about issues in portraying God and popular culture. And we talked about the larger picture of can you even do that? Not really, according to Jewish sources. Here, the idea of the Yetzer, literally the evil inclination that everybody has, is something that whether people are interested in religion or not, they understand this, that everybody has a good side and a bad side, or different parts of themselves. So there's a huge amount of material on this. What I would like to do in this session is to look at 3 or 4 ideas regarding the Yetzer that appear in pop culture, in certain aspects of pop culture, and then to show how Torah sources fit with those ideas. So before we look at the sources, let me show a few pictures of some things we're going to look at in the course of this session. We'll look at a little bit of Star Trek, the original series, specifically the Enemy Within, the 5th episode from Star Trek. Well, assuming that we have time, we'll look at a certain analysis of that particular episode in the book, The Ethics of Star Trek. Then we'll talk a little bit about the strange case of, well, this is actually this book cover actually puts in the word "the." Robert Louis Stevenson just called it "Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde," and I'm going to compare that with a particular scene from the Marvel movie Captain America: The First Avenger. That will be the second idea. The third idea will relate to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, specifically the 1971 film with Gene Wilder. This is what's on the screen right now is a book written by the director of that movie, and we'll have a quote from that book. I just want to compare a few editions, book covers from this book, which is, whether you like it or not, it is a classic by any standard of children's literature. The first illustrator, Joseph Schindelman, already back in 1964. A few editions have his illustrations. This cover. Well, I'm not so familiar with this particular cover, but it's an interesting one. Also from the Schindelman illustrations. Faith Jacques did totally different kinds of illustrations. Michael Foreman did very weird set of illustrations. This is all for the same book. And there's a newer edition, just a few years old, where the Schindelman edition illustrations are on the inside, but the cover was done by Ivan Brunetti with totally different drawing style. The artist who's most associated with Roald Dahl is Quentin Blake, and this is one of the editions that he did. And here's a more recent one. You see on the bottom right, it says 50 because this book was published in 1964. So just 6 years ago, they had the 5th edition. No, 6 years ago? 64, 70. Yeah, 50th edition of this book. And we will we'll show a clip or 2 from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And I'm going to briefly talk about the other versions of productions of the Chocolate Factory. Weird one, Tom and Jerry, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Then there's the Johnny Depp movie from 2005. The 2004 musical. If you haven't heard of it, that's because it's not a musical that was on Broadway. It's a musical that was designed for amateur theater groups. So there are 3 versions of it, all done by the same people. There's Roald Dahl's Willy Wonka, which is the main play that has 2 acts. and then Willy Wonka Jr., which you could have for, I guess, junior high, and then there's Willy Wonka Kids, which you could have elementary school kids acting. It's all variations of the same play. It did make it to Broadway in 2013. It was made into all new musical in London's West End, and then a few years after that, it went to Broadway in New York for a couple of years. And then, if we have time, which I'm not sure we will, but I'd like to end by talking a little about the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Subtitle is Letters from a Senior to a Junior Devil. And there's a wide range of covers of this book. Let's briefly look at 4. Here's the first one, not in chronological order. Second, third, that's the one that I happen to own, and fourth. Anyway, let's go back to Star Trek. The Star Trek, the original series, was on television from 1966 to 1969. Only 3 seasons. This is over 50 years ago. You might have heard of it, even though it hasn't been on officially for. The reason you've heard of it is because it continued in reruns for long enough to become this huge phenomenon, and all sorts of spin-offs. But in some ways, the Star Trek, the original series it doesn't hold up in terms of the production, in terms of the special effects, whatever they had of special effects in the late 1960s, but the ideas are certainly still discussed. And there are a few different episodes of Star Trek that involve the good Kirk and the bad Kirk, the good Spock and the bad Spock, with all different scenarios to come up with this. Perhaps the most famous one is not the one we're going to look at, but in which the crew of the Enterprise run into their counterparts from a parallel universe, and you could tell that the other Spock is evil because he wears a goatee. That's how you could tell instantly he's the evil one, and this became a theme for the TV show Community. Anyway, we're going to look at what the episode, The Enemy Within, says about the Yetzer, an interesting theory. You don't have to accept it, but it's an interesting one. So the summary of this episode, or the setup of this episode, is here in source number 1. Summarized in the Ethics of Star Trek. So there are some people on the planet, some members of the crew on the planet. The transporter malfunctions. Kirk returns from the landing party, woozy and shaken. The engineering team escorts him to his quarters, unaware that a second Kirk is about to materialize on the platform. The second Kirk looks exactly like the first one, except that he's more wild-eyed and sweaty. But same face, same clothes. So Kirk's animalistic double runs amok, committing violent, impulsive acts, including sexually assaulting Yeoman Rand, which causes all sorts of problems when the good Kirk shows up. Though the manic Kirk is eventually held at bay, the rational Kirk finds himself, here's the part that's not so predictable, utterly incapable of making command decisions so long as he remains separated from his emotional self. So why does this matter? Because that crisis can have deadly ramifications for the crew members who are freezing to death on that planet. The captain needs to be able to decide what to do, but he can't make a decision. So let's look at a part of this episode, optimized for motion and video. You have a point, Spock?
Here, an unusual opportunity to appraise the human mind, or to examine, in Earth terms, the roles of good and evil in a man. His negative side, which you call hostility, lust, violence, and his positive side, which Earth people express as compassion, love, tenderness. It's the captain's guts you're analyzing. Are you aware of that, Spock? Yes.
Yeah.
And what is it that makes one man an exceptional leader? We see here indications that it is his negative side which makes him strong.
Aha.
His evil side, if you will, properly controlled and disciplined, is vital to his strength. Your negative side, removed from you, the power of command begins to elude you.
What is your point, Mr. Spock?
If your power of command continues to weaken, you'll soon be unable to function as captain. You must be prepared for that. You have your intellect, Jim. You can fight with that.
Okay. Now we're going to move to a few minutes ahead. Do one more scene from this episode where the good Kirk, or more like the rational Kirk, if you want to call him that, is trying to help the animalistic or emotional one who's lying down and seems to be dying.
What happened?
Apparently, the body functioning weakened during the duplication process. In fact, I failed to consider. He's not dying. Yes, he is.
Help me.
How can he die?
How can I survive without him?
I don't know, Jim.
Don't be afraid.
Special effects, played by the same person.
Man. Hold on. You don't have to be afraid. I won't let go. Hold on. You won't be afraid if you use your mind and think. Think. You can do it. That's it.
Jim, he is back.
In both cases, thinking helped. For both Kirks, thinking helped.
Jim, you can use that brandy now. In fact, I'll join you.
I have to take him back. Inside myself. I can't survive without him. I don't want to take him back. He's like an animal. A thoughtless, brutal animal. And it's me. Me.
Jim, you're not different than anyone else. We all have our darker side. We need it. It's half of what we are. It's not really ugly. It's human.
Human.
Yes, human. A lot of what he is makes you the man you are. God forbid I should have to agree with Spock, but he was right.
Uh-huh.
Without the negative side, you wouldn't be the captain. You couldn't be, and you know it. Your strength of command lies mostly in him.
What do I have?
You have the goodness,
Not enough. I have a ship to command.
the intelligence, the logic. It appears your half has most of that. And perhaps that's where man's essential courage comes from.
Oh.
For you see, he was afraid, and you weren't.
Aha. Ooh, okay. There's a bunch of ideas here. I see that some people were commenting as we were watching it. See, Rebecca wrote, it's interesting that Dr. Barad refers to this as the emotional self. I would disagree. That version of Kirk isn't emotional Kirk. He's egocentric and power-hungry Kirk. Yes, so that actually brings out a point, which is, what do you mean by Yetzer Hatov and Yetzer Hara? A lot of the time, there are shifting definitions. Sometimes we mean rational, emotional, and sometimes we mean the part of us that wants to do the good thing, part of us that wants to do the bad thing. And those are not exactly the same as each other. So yes, to some extent, any discussion of the Yetzer Hara is going to run into that, but that's okay. It's flexible enough that we can have enough insights to cover ourselves. Right. Okay. I see Rebecca wrote, quote unquote, good Kirk simply lacks drive, lacks desire. And Mark wrote that the other Kirk is Kirk's nefesh bahamit, the expression for our animalistic side, which is But animalistic normally, I'm agreeing, but animalistic normally has a negative connotation, as we're going to see shortly with Jekyll and Hyde. Oh, there's the good side and the bad side. This is a more sophisticated point. First of all, that the Kirk, without his animalistic side, can't make any decisions. That's a problem. That's not the good side. Oh, if only we could get rid of the bad, then we'd be better. No, we would be flawed. We would be missing something. And furthermore, what's explicit here from McCoy at the end, perhaps that's where man's essential courage comes from. For the irrational half, the animalistic half, was afraid, and you weren't. Why is the nicer, kinder, gentler Kirk, why was he not afraid? Because of his intelligence. So in both, and through these two quotes, both the nicer side and the animalistic side, they both are flawed to the extent that one can live without the other. It's only with the intelligence. But really, they both need each other, which is what ends up happening. Spoiler alert: by the end of the episode, they end up getting back together. But I like the way that Dr. Barad or Barrett, I'm not sure, comments on this in that book that I mentioned before, the Ethics of Star Trek. It's a different cover from the one that I showed, but it's the same book. As much as we need emotional energy in order to command, we must also harness that energy. So the animalistic side has that energy, but can't make decisions either. You need to be able to combine the different sides of yourself in order to make decisions. So our emotions enable us to perform actions more promptly and easily than rationality alone. And if controlled by reason, our emotions can actually intensify our moral life. I should add that I think she points out, I know I've seen this a bunch of places, that in some ways the main three characters in Star Trek, the original series, represent this in the episodes in general, that Spock is obviously the logical side and McCoy is the emotional side. They're both good, but they're both one-sided. And you need the captain to be able to balance the two of them, to be able to listen to both of them and then make the decision. So that theme ends up being played out in Star Trek in general. But in this particular episode, I just thought it was interesting that, as formulated here near the end of source number 3, courage and fear may seem to be mutually exclusive, but they're actually compatible. The truly brave person not only fears what they should when there's a reasonable basis for the fear, but they can also stand up to this fear and confront danger. So that it's an interesting perspective which we don't usually associate with, quote unquote, the Yetzer Hara. That maybe the Yetzer Hara has, aside from getting us to do bad things, the Yetzer Hara also gets us to do a lot of good things. And you've probably seen one or both of the following two sources from Chazal, but these two sources, between the two of them, make it pretty clear that the Yetzer Hara is necessary for individuals and for the world. Look at source number 4. Gemara Midrash and Breshit Rabbah on the words, and God looked at everything that He created, v'hinei tov ma'od, and it was very good. So the Midrash says, I understand hinei tov ma'od. Oh, that's the Yetzer Tov. That's our good side. But why does it say v'hinei tov ma'od? Why does it add an extra vav? That must be referring to the Yetzer Hara. And it was very good. That's the Yetzer Hara. And the Midrash asks, what? How can it be that the bad desire is very good? Not just good, but very good. And the Midrash answers, if not for the Yetzer Hara, nobody would build a house. Nobody would get married. Nobody would have children. Nobody would even do business. So what do we call that? That the part of us that gets us to do things, to accomplish. Guess what? That's the same Yetzer Hara that gets us to sin. We need that. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't accomplish anything. All these good things, we need that drive. It's not exactly the same thing as from the Star Trek episode. This is more formulated as, I guess, what Freud would call eros. which is the power of sex, but it's also the power of doing things, the power of life, as opposed to Thanatos, the power of death. So that's the Midrash, and the Gemara, which brings out the necessity of the Yetzer Hara, is in source number 5. It's a long Gemara. I'm just going to read parts of it. It's also a very weird Gemara, and a bunch of commentaries say it's not meant to be taken literally, but it tells a story about during the time of Tanakh, there were still Nevi'im around. The leaders decided that they had enough of the Yetzer Hara and they would ask God to allow them to get rid of the Yetzer Hara. The only reason I'm just going to read parts of this in source number 5 in the middle of the first paragraph. Like, this is the same thing. This Yetzer Hara is responsible for the destruction of the temple and our exile. Klum Yahavi Telan El Kabule Beit Agra. But isn't the whole reason why we were given it in the first place in order to get reward by conquering the Yetzer Hara? Well, you know what? We'd rather not have the reward and just not have the Yetzer Hara at all. So God does a miracle for them, and God gives over into their power the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah. The Yetzer Hara, the drive to worship idols or to worship multiple gods. And very weird formulation here. The Yetzer Hara appears to them as a lion, Kiguria Denura, a lion made of fire, Mibeit Kodesh HaKadoshim. And where did it come from? Not just the Beit HaMikdash, it came from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, the place where nobody's allowed to go, even the Kohen Gadol, except at the holiest moment of the year. That's where that came from. That's really weird. And all the commentaries have to figure out what this is referring to. They end up imprisoning this Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara doesn't spell out what the implications are. If we really, I've taught like more or less all shir just on this. I'll just mention briefly, just to make some sense out of this. Rav Kook has a fascinating interpretation of this, and just like a couple of lines, I think it's in Orot, where he says the desire to serve idols, which we don't have anymore, right? Like, it sounds like from Tanakh that it was this huge deal, and it undermined everything, and it caused the Jews to be punished over and over again. And just like, really, we don't really have that anymore. So it's because of this Gemara. They got rid of the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. But Rav Kook says the Yetzer Hara, the strong desire to serve idols, was the same desire as the strong desire to serve God. We don't have that anymore because they got rid of it. And that's why when we read in Sefer Vayikra about all the korbanot and all the animal sacrifices, we're like, really? Like, ew, blood, guts, whatever, even if you're not a vegetarian. So Rav Kook uses this Gemara to explain why, A, there doesn't seem to be much of a desire for Avodah Zarah in most people today, and B, there isn't much of a desire for the Beit HaMikdash and korbanot anymore. But Rav Kook goes on to say, in messianic times, or whatever, at some point in the future, God will give us back that desire. Meaning, don't worry, when Mashiach builds the Beit HaMikdash, or Mashiach comes and Hashem sends down Beit HaMikdash from heaven, that's Rambam and Rashi accordingly, we won't have Beit HaMikdash without the desire to serve God with doing something physical. We will get the desire back. But at the same time, we will also have the desire to serve idols. And all of the good and all of the bad will come together because you can't separate them. So according to Rav Kook, that point from, Rav Kook is not quoting Star Trek. Rav Kook died in 1935. This episode was from 1966. But it's similar idea. You can't command, just like you can't command without your animalistic side. You can't desire to really serve God unless you have the same desire to serve idols. Anyway, the Gemara goes on to say that the same leaders at that time said, "Hey, we're on a roll now. Let's see if we can get rid of the Yetzer Hara for Gilui Arayot, the desire for sexual offenses, for all the violations in the Torah, adultery, incest, etc." So God gave them that Yetzer Hara as well, and they said, "But wait a minute! But if we get rid of this Yetzer Hara, the world will be destroyed. And Rashi explains there won't be any pru'avu anymore. The same sex drive that leads to adultery is the same sex drive that leads to people getting married and having children. You can't separate them. So it says they didn't know what to do. They waited 3 days while the sexual Yetzer Hara was in captivity. And what happened? During that time, they looked for eggs. They looked for fresh eggs. And in all of the land of Israel, they could not find any fresh eggs. Meaning, not only is the desire for illicit sex the same desire as for illicit sex, but it's the same desire that causes life, that causes chickens to lay eggs. You can't have life without the desire for illicit sex. So the compromise was they blinded this Yetzer Hara and let it go. And as a result of blinding it, that's why, for the most part, nobody is tempted by incest anymore. Apparently, according to this Gemara, it used to be a big temptation, like Avodah Zarah was a big temptation. Now, adultery is still a temptation, but not incest. It's a very clever Gemara. It ties all sorts of things together, and it fits very well with the idea that we were saying about you can't be without your Yetzer Hara. It's part of life. It's part of what helps you to exist. I now want to move on to a different, much less known idea. The idea, now granted this isn't fiction, but still, that the Yetzer Hara can be amplified by a special drug. And this idea appears in the book that I mentioned before. See, we're not going to have time to go through, compare all different versions, but the trope of split personalities goes back to this book from Robert Louis Stevenson from 1886, and it's been done in movies dozens of times. It's been done in all sorts of adaptations over and over again, all sorts of variations. But as pointed out, we're not going to get to go through it now, but as pointed out on source number 6 in the website TV Tropes, it's the unbuilt version of the trope, in the sense that the standard version of the split personality story is presented differently in the original story. And let's just look at it briefly. This is top right of the page from TV Tropes. Instead of being, in the original book, instead of being a nice person who has his polar opposite manifest itself, Dr. Jekyll in the book is a secretly perverted man who takes the potion willingly, as it will allow him to indulge his worst traits without ruining his reputation as an esteemed doctor. And it's, in that sense, it's even more disturbing than all the variations in which he splits into the nicer version and the evil version. No, in the book, he splits into who he was originally, the Dr. Jekyll who is tempted by all sorts of things, not especially good, and his super evil side. Why am I telling you this? You know all this already. But I thought it was so interesting that in the last part of the book, well, remember, there's so much to say about this, but I'm gonna skip through it. Dr. Jekyll, knowing that he's dying, writes up a confession of what happened. And he says, had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, all would have been otherwise, and from these agonies of death and birth I had come forth, meaning I would have come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action, it was neither diabolical nor divine, but it shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and that which stood within ran forth. At that time my virtue slumbered, meaning I have not been a good person in general, Dr. Jekyll says, so my evil was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. In other words, unlike the more standard version, which is more or less what Star Trek did, what if you could split a personality into two, in the original book, Jekyll and Hyde are not two opposites. Jekyll is the problematic person from beginning to end, and Hyde is his evil side, but if only he had taken this potion with good intentions, what would have come out would have been his pure side, his angelic side, which does not actually exist in the story at all. And I thought this goes really well with the movie Captain America: The First Avenger, in which before Steve Rogers is given the super soldier serum, which will turn him into permanently into Captain America, he sits down and talks with the Jewish scientist. Well, he's not called Jewish, but he talks Jewish. He escaped Hitler, etc. Who explains about the serum, and he talks about the background. Was there was this guy, Johann Schmidt, who was working for Hitler, who had become convinced there was a great power waiting to be seized by a superior man. When he heard about my formula, he couldn't resist. Schmidt must become that superior man, the Ubermensch in Nazi terms. So Steve asks, did it make him stronger? And the doctor says, yeah, there were other effects, which we don't know yet at this part of the movie. We'll only discover near the end of the movie that it turns him into the Red Skull. The serum was not ready. But, more important, the serum amplifies everything that is inside. So good becomes great and bad becomes worse. And that's why you, altruistic Steve Rogers, were chosen, because the strong man who's known power all his life may lose respect for that power, but a weak man, and he's been very weak, Steve, knows the value of strength and knows compassion. Just the premise. I know it's science fiction, but still, fantasy, speculative fiction. But the premise that there's a serum, it's not exactly the same as from Stevenson, a serum that amplifies everything that's inside. So good becomes great, bad becomes worse. Schmidt becomes an arch villain, and Steve Rogers becomes a superhero. And this reminds me of the following Gemara in source number 9. This is one of a bunch of Gemaras that address the issue of bad rabbis. How could it be that isn't learning Torah supposed to make you a better person? So how could it be that not just nowadays, but all the way back to the time of the Gemara in at least 3 or 4 places addresses the issue of people who know a lot of Torah and they're still bad people? Short answer is, it doesn't say anywhere in our sources that learning Torah makes you a better person. Can make you a better person. Look at the way it's formulated here in the Gemara. Oy lahem, woe to l'sonehem shel tamid chachamim. Literally, the enemies of the rabbis, which is a euphemism for the rabbis. Woe to those rabbis, shoskin b'Torah, ve'ein behen yirat shamayim, who learn Torah but they don't fear God. Wow, woe to them. Like they have now become worse people. Skipping a little bit, the Gemara says, and this fits with the famous pasuk, the one that we say when we lift the Torah in Shul. V'zod haTorah asher sam Moshe ofnei bnei Israel. This is the Torah that Moshe placed sam in front of the Jews. So the Gemara makes a drush on the word sam, which is spelled with a sin and it means to place, makes a homiletic reading of it as if it said sam with a samech. Sam with a samech is a drug. Why is the Torah compared to a drug? Because zacha naset lo sam chayim, lo zacha naset lo sam mita. If the person has the merit, has the zechut, then the Torah becomes a drug of life. It gives him life and makes him a better person. But if he does not have the merit, in other words, in the context of God, he just learns Torah without the moral background, naset lo sam mita, then the Torah becomes a drug of death. Learning Torah makes him a worse person than he was before. So even though people like to say, oh, the Torah will make you a better person, no. The Torah, under certain conditions, will make you a better person. The Torah will bring out what you have already. Like that serum in the movie, if you're good, it brings and makes you a better person. Good becomes great, and bad becomes worse. I just thought that was an interesting compare and contrast between the among the 3 sources: Stevenson, Steve Rogers, and the Gemara in Yuma. Now let's switch to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I want to do 2 things. I want to, in a few minutes, I want to talk about Willy Wonka and the Zohar. That will be in source number 11. But I first want to talk about how what's generally considered to be the better movie of the different movie and musical adaptations, the one with Gene Wilder from 71, what that changed from Roald Dahl's book. So Mel Stewart, the director of the movie, who decades later came the shooting script for Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. A number of major transformations, and the most important alteration was to emphasize the moral fallibility that exists in all of us, dun dun dun, also known as the Yetzer. This was expressed in two plots, or two interlocking plots. The creation of the everlasting gobstopper test, which did not exist in the book, although the candy did. An everlasting gobstopper is one of the greatest candy inventions ever. Piece of candy you can suck and suck, it never gets any smaller. When Wonka gives each child a prized everlasting gobstopper in the 71 movie, he makes them promise that they'll never give it to anyone, setting up a moral dilemma for each of them. And you see Violet, one of the bad kids. You can see she crosses her fingers behind her back when she agrees. So obviously she's planning to betray him. So Gobstopper becomes the ultimate test of their honesty and integrity. Although only for Charlie does it play out that way. That's one aspect that they threw in that is not in the book. And to tempt the kids into a moral behavior and to add a sense of menace to the film, but nowhere near as much menace as in the Johnny Depp film, we strengthened the part of Slugworth, who, Mr. Wonka's candy-making competitor, whom Dahl only alludes to in the novel. He does not appear as a character, except in passing, in the original novel. Slugworth, in the movie, is a sinister-looking figure who confronts each finder of Wonka's golden ticket shortly after they wrapped at Wonka Bar, and he whispers something in each kid's ear. Oh, and he leans over their left shoulder, just like every time you ever see in a TV or movie where somebody has a dilemma and you see on their shoulders appear the angel and the devil. The devil's always on their left shoulder. Okay, so it's a quick, iconic way of representing. Even when you don't know who this guy is, you know he is bad. The audience doesn't know what Slugworth is saying until he confronts Charlie. And in the ensuing conversation, he promises to make Charlie incredibly rich if he will steal an everlasting gobstopper and bring it to Slugworth. And we then realize that all the children have received the same offer. Okay? So what happens in the movie? And since I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm going to share the climactic scene near the end of the movie. Just a minute. Here it is. Share. Whoops. Just a second. Share that. Okay. Second, just need to get to the right moment. 134. 134.25. Right. So I skipped the part about the fizzy lifting drinks, but for our purposes, just remember that Willy Wonka. Actually, you know what? Willy Wonka yells at them when Charlie's the last one. He says, "You ruined my fizzy drinks room, and you get nothing. Good day." And Grandpa Joe, who's been pretty nice until now, says to Charlie on their way out, "I'll get even with him if it's the last thing I ever hear."
If wants a gobstopper, he'll get one.
But Charlie stops. A lot is about to happen now.
Mr. Wonka?
He gives back. He's not going to betray him.
So shines a good deed in a weary world. Charlie, my boy.
You won! You did it! You did it! I knew you would! I just knew you would!
Oh, Charlie, forgive me for putting you through this. Please, forgive me.
Come in, Mr. Wilkinson. Charlie, meet Mr. Wilkinson.
Pleasure.
Slugworth.
No, that's not Slugworth. He works for me.
For you?
I had to test you, Charlie, and you passed the test.
You won!
What?
The jackpot, my dear sir. The grand and glorious jackpot.
The chocolate?
The chocolate, yes, the chocolate. But that's just the beginning. We have to get on. We have so much time and so little to do. Strike that. Reverse it. This way, please.
So the person who, this is a real surprise, the person who appeared 5 times as the tempter, the one who's tempting the children to give him a everlasting gobstopper. It turns out he wasn't really Slugworth. He was really Wilkinson, who works for Willy Wonka. This was made up for the movie. It was not in the original book. And this brings me to, before we go back and talk about how this compares with the Zohar, I made this little chart after I looked at all the different versions of the, or at least researched the different versions of this. It turns out that even though, just answering the simple question, what does Charlie do to deserve winning the chocolate factory? There are 5 different answers to this question, each one given in a different version. In other words, even though in Dahl's original book, what does Charlie do? Nothing. He's the only one who's left after the other kids misbehave, or if you want to put it in Jewish terms, sur meira. He hasn't done anything right, but he hasn't done anything wrong, and that's good enough. He wins the chocolate factory just by not doing anything wrong. For Roald Dahl, that's the correct response. That's why Charlie deserves it. And apparently, this is a little note from the Wikipedia article on the Willy Wonka 71 movie. Dahl was infuriated by the deviations in the plot devised by the other writer, including the whole Slugworth thing, the whole busy lifting drinks. Why was he infuriated at it? Because it ruined his original point, which is you don't have to be a good person. You just have to not be a bad person. But not only did David Seltzer, who was the other writer for the movie, when Roald Dahl did his not only did he change that, but 3 other versions of the story all gave other endings, and they all rejected Dahl's original ending. In all of them, Charlie does something positive in order to deserve winning the factory. So what we just saw from the Gene Wilder film, and also the Tom and Jerry remake, which is a very weird, it's the same as the 1971 film, but without Gene Wilder, but it follows it in a lot of ways, but it throws in Tom and Jerry, which is a weird mashup. Anyway, it also has a whole subplot about Slugworth chasing Tom and Jerry through the factory. If you like Tom and Jerry, I would definitely recommend it. It's a little weird otherwise. But what does Charlie do? He deserves to win because he returned the gobstopper instead of giving in the temptation. It's not a temptation just to make money. His family is very poor. It's understandable. And yet, Charlie overcomes that temptation. Put it in classic Jewish terms, he is Koveshet Yitzro. Remember back in the previous series, Best of Both Worlds, we compared Superman to a Hasid and Batman to a Koveshet Yitzro. Anyway, Koveshet Yitzro is a big deal. Overcoming your Yetzer Hara. That's what we're talking about in this session. Dahl did not like that. But what I thought was interesting was in 3 other versions, they rejected the Slugworth plot, and they wrote all different subplots in order to give a different answer to the question, why does Charlie deserve winning the chocolate factory? So in the I'm going to skip the 2004 musical because I want to come back to that. In the Johnny Depp film, at first, Charlie does nothing. He's the least rotten of the kids. But then Willy Wonka says to him, and this is only in the Depp film, he says, you win the chocolate factory on condition that you move in with me in the chocolate factory and you abandon your family. Family is bad. So Charlie's like, no, I like my family, and he goes home. And at some point after that, he feels bad for Willy Wonka, so he comes back, and there's a whole subplot which is only in this version, which Willy Wonka was an oppressed child, and his father was a dentist who wouldn't let him eat candy at all, and he ended up running away from home, and they've been estranged for years, and Charlie reconciles Willy Wonka with his father, when they end up finding him, it turns out the father has been collecting newspaper clippings of Willy Wonka all along. He really has been proud of him the whole time. Wow, you see, family is really important after all, and that's why Charlie deserves to get the factory. So that's a lot of extra plot in order to give a different answer to this question, but it's yet another answer to this question. That's why Charlie deserves it. It's not enough that he just didn't do anything wrong. And the musical, the London and Broadway musical, they had something that really in retrospect, again, not in retrospect, compared to the other ones, doesn't seem that impressive, but it's that really Charlie can't stop himself from coming up with candy ideas, and he adds ideas to the notebook that Willy Wonka has, and Willy Wonka's like, oh, you deserve to be the next candy maker, which is understandable, but it's not really a moral issue. So let's forget about that. Let's go back to the third answer that I skipped before, the one that is called, where did I put it? Page 6. Sorry. Right. The one that is called Roald Dahl's Willy Wonka, which you haven't seen unless you've seen it put on by a local production. They licensed the script for people to put on in their amateur groups, and they have 3 different versions of it. In this version, they got rid of the Slugworth plot, but they kept the fizzy lifting drink part. So skip here. Here I copied down at the bottom here. I copied from the script. Willy Wonka says to them, I'm sure you could find your own way out. And Grandpa Joe says, what about Charlie's lifetime supply of chocolate? And Wonka says, oh, yeah, each of the children will receive their chocolate. P.S. I just want to interrupt this and say that in the London and Broadway musical, what Willy Wonka says at this point is, lifetime supply of chocolate? I gave you an everlasting gobstopper. That's your lifetime supply of candy. Goodbye. Which is really sneaky. Anyway, so Charlie says goodbye, but then he hesitates, and then he says, just a moment, Mr. Wonka, I don't deserve a lifetime supply of chocolate. I tasted the fizzy lifting drink, and I broke the rules. Unlike in the 71 movie where Willy Wonka knows about it and kicks him out because of it, here Charlie confesses, I broke the rules, I'm very sorry, but thank you for a wonderful day and the most wonderful tour of your factory, etc., etc. And Wonka says, bless you, Charlie, you just did it. And Willy Wonka says, I created this entire competition with just one purpose in mind, to find the perfect person to make new candy dreams come true. That's the same in all the different versions. And Wonka says, this whole thing was a test of character, which is only in this musical and in the 71 film. The next sentence is only in this version. I carefully selected all the rooms that would tempt each of our golden ticket winners. Aha, very clever. The TV room for Mike TV, and the room with the chocolate river, the room where everything's edible for the kid who eats everything. Aha, that's not in the other versions, but very clever. You, Charlie, did something quite remarkable. You gave in to temptation. You were smart enough not to get caught, and yet you admitted your guilt. So that combination, it's not any one of the 3, it's all 3. He gave in to temptation, and he was good enough to not get caught, which is something. Like you need that, I guess, to survive in business, I guess. And yet you admitted your guilt. Wow. So he didn't have to. He wasn't caught, unlike in the 71 film. So according to this version, what makes Charlie deserve to win the factory is he did tshuva. He said vidui. Wow. That's an impressive version, and I wish that this version that this musical were better known. Anyway, let's get back to the Zohar. The Zohar appears here on Surah. I'm skipping the interpretation of it, and if we have time, we'll go back to it. Just a second. Here it is. The Zohar in source number 12. The Zohar gives a radical interpretation of the Yetzer that's going to fit very well with the place of Slugworth in the 71 film. Okay, ready? Elvade Yetzer Reuta Demare Avid. Yetzer is doing the will of God. Umalka, now we give a mashal, an allegory. There was a king, Dahavale Bar Yechidai, he had only one son. Vavarachim le Yatir, and the king loved his son a lot. Upakida le berachimu, delo yikarev garme itzta bisha. And God, the king, in his love, he commanded his son not to go to a bad woman, a woman of ill repute. Began to laman dikarev legaba lav kedai ihla Allah gav palter and demalka, because if you would be the kind of prince who frequents prostitutes, then he wouldn't be worthy morally of becoming the next king. Udile ahu bara lemevad rute da'avui berachimu. And the son pledged to do what his father wanted, and he would not go to a prostitute. Now here's where it gets interesting. Beveta de Malka lebar, outside of the palace, Havachada Zona. There was a prostitute, Ya'ah, who was beautiful, Ya'ah b'chezu, beautiful in appearance, B'shapira b'reva, gorgeous, Liomina. One day, Amar Malka, the king said, Ba'ina v'mechme ru'uta debari legabai. I want to see if my son is actually doing what I said. So he decided to tempt his son. Karla lahi zona. He called in the prostitute Valmarla, and the king said to her, Zili v'tifatei libri. I want you to try to seduce my son. L'mechme reuta dibari legabai, to see if he overcomes temptation and does what I ask. He zona. So now the Zohar kind of pulls out from the story a little bit and asks, that prostitute, my avdit, what does she do? Azlat abatre debre, she goes after the son, Bre de Malka, the prince. Sharat lechav kale unash kale, she starts hugging and kissing him, lefati le become a pituyan, and to try to seduce him. That's what the king asked for. Ihav brayaut, if the prince does the right thing, and he listens to the command of his father, what does he do? Ga'arba, he yells at the prostitute, v'la aset la, he doesn't listen to her, v'dachi la mine, and he pushes her away. Kedain avoy chadi bebre, and the father sees what his son is doing or finds out. V'alei legav pargoda dehechme, he brings him into the palace. V'yivle matzanan, he gives the prince gifts. Nevaz v'zav yikar saga, and gives him a lot of wealth. In other words, he appoints him his official successor. Maybe there were other princes, and there was a question of choosing him or not. It's not clear. Here's where we get to the point. Man garim kol ha-yikar lahai bara. So who caused all that wealth to go to the prince? Haviema, you should say, hahizona. The thanks go to that prostitute. Because if not for her, the prince would not have been able to show the king that he was listening to him. But he's ona, and as for that prostitute, itla shavcha b'hai olo. Does she get praised or not? Vade shvacha itla mikol sitrin. For sure, the prostitute should be praised. Chad, first of all, the abdet pekuda demalka. She was only trying to seduce the prince because she was doing what the king wanted. V'chad, and another reason is the garment leilahu bara l'cholahu hahu tivu. She indirectly caused the prince to get all the great wealth and honor, and get all the love of his father. V'alda, regarding this kativ, it says in Bereshit, this should look familiar. We saw it. V'hinei tov ma'od. V'hinei tov da malach chayim. Ma'od da malach hamavet. Slightly different drasha, but it ends up the same thing. V'hinei tov ma'od includes the angel of life and the angel of death, also known as the good inclination, the bad inclination. Te'ihu vadai tov ma'od. The Yetzer is definitely very good. L'man da'atet pekudin demare, to someone who listens to the commands of our master, God, who made the Yetzer but gave us mitzvot, and we should only get reward for listening to the mitzvot, for following the mitzvot, because we're tempted to do otherwise. If not for the temptation, we wouldn't deserve any reward. The Tachazeh, come and look. Ilah Yehei Ahai Mekatraga, if not for the heavenly accuser, the Yetzer, the Satan, accuser in heaven, La Yartun Tzadikaya Haneg Gandaya Ilayan. All the righteous would not deserve to inherit all the great treasures in heaven or in the Garden of Eden. Dizaminin Liarta La'alma Da'ate, well, which they're going to inherit in the world to come. If it doesn't matter that you are righteous in theory, to deserve reward, you need to be righteous in practice. And the only way that you can be righteous in practice is if you're tempted and you don't give in to temptation. So the one who pointed this out, the one who connected Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory 71 film with the Zohar is somebody named Mordechai Hausman, who is a chassid from an English-speaking background, who's written a bunch of essays and machshava on his website, Being Jewish. And he tells the whole story, basically summarizes the movie, assuming that you haven't seen it. I assume that we have seen it. And he says, Wilkinson is Slugworth. Slugworth was sent out to each of the children to test them. Aha. So Christians take Slugworth at face value. Who is the devil? A reprehensible competitor. Well, stop at nothing to undo Wonka. That's how they view Satan. But Jews don't see it that way. Just as Slugworth is really Wilkinson doing what Wonka asked him to do, the Satan, the Yetzer Hara, is also not working for himself. Satan means, he says it means hinderer. I would say it means the accuser in heaven. That God created the hinderer to give us work to do in this world. The Satan is here to make things difficult for us so that we can overcome our evil inclinations and pass the test. So that doesn't mean that David Seltzer, the screenwriter for Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, was aware of the Zohar, but he certainly seems to have hit on a similar idea. I thought that was fascinating. So in our remaining few minutes, I want to talk briefly about the Screwtape letters, which is a book of the psychology of the Yetzer Hara. It's sophisticated enough. I would not recommend it for children and even adults. You have to keep switching in your mind because it's a senior Yetzer Hara is writing a letter to a junior Yetzer Hara how to tempt the person you've been assigned to. And he keeps referring to the enemy, capital E. And as you're reading it, you're like, oh yeah, the enemy is God. Because C.S. Lewis, who wrote this book, was a theologian. So he's starting from a Christian perspective, and that part, the duality that Satan and the devil is the enemy of God. Okay, that we can't get on board with. But once you get past that, the premise of how do you tempt somebody? Okay, if you could imagine the Yetzer Hara giving lessons, what would they be? So Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was told his students a bunch of times when he was asked to suggest a book of Musar, he would suggest the Screwtape letters. And even though he didn't write this in print, it fits with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's famous essay on Torah Umada and what the value of literature is that he wrote in 1963, in which he says general knowledge also helps us preserve our faith. That when he quotes the Mishnah Perkei Avot, V'da ma'asha tashiv la'apikoros, you should know what to answer the heretic. And Rav Lichtenstein says this apikoros could be the apikoros within, in ourselves. We must be ready to reply to his prefer of the bittersweet apple, but we must first read a treatise on serpentine psychology. Well, you know what? There's not a lot of books on the psychology of the Yetzer Hara, and the Screwtape letters, is one of them. Written by C.S. Lewis, who's better known these days for writing the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote it in 1942. It's subtle. It makes a lot of subtle points. A lot of these points don't exist in any Musar Sefer, as far as I know. And it's worth reading. It's also worth it's worth listening to the audio version, which I'll just play briefly, just a second. It's not the entire. Oh wait, that's not what I meant to do. Just a minute. Share content. Here it is. Here it is. Okay. It turns out the audio version of the Screwtape letters is read by John Cleese. Even if you're not a huge fan of Monty Python, okay, you can't compare. You can't compare just reading a book with hearing John Cleese be the Yetzer Hara. And I'll just play brief parts of it now.
The use of fashions in thought is to distract the attention of men from their real dangers. we direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices to which it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to that vice which we are trying to make endemic. The game is to have them all running around with fire extinguishers whenever there's a flood, and all crowding to that side of the boat which is already nearly gunwale under. Thus, we make it fashionable to expose the dangers of enthusiasm at the very moment when they are all really becoming worldly and lukewarm. A century later, when we are really making them all Byronic and drunk with emotion, the fashionable outcry is directed against the dangers of the mere understanding. Cruel ages are put on their guard against sentimentality, feckless and idle ones against respectability, lecherous ones against puritanism. And whenever all men are really hastening to be slaves or tyrants, we make liberalism the prime bogey.
Wow. That's a lot. That's a lot in just one paragraph. The words are right here in source number 18. The words are those of C.S. Lewis as presented by the Yetzer, Screwtape. But I don't know. For me, it's just listening to John Cleese read it is just a special experience. Anyway, our time is up. I will end the recording, and then for those who can stay, I'll go through the comments in the chat and ask if anybody has anything else to say. But our time is up, and we covered most of it. And I appreciate everybody for being here, and thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next week.